Hi everyone, Daljeet Peterson here from astrolab21.com. And in this video we're going to be exploring America's Pluto return, what I'm calling the unconscious desire of the soul of a nation. And I'm really excited about this video. This is one I've been looking forward to producing here for a while. And this has been something that's been a long time coming, 246 years to be exact. So what does it mean for America to have its Pluto return? Well, if we think about the planet Pluto, it takes 248 years to make one full orbit around the sun. So Pluto's year is 248 Earth years. So, you know, any person could never have a Pluto return. No one lives long enough for Pluto to return to the place where it was when we were born, unless we live to be 248 years old. But so far, none of us have figured that out. Who knows, though, with AI and CRISPR and everything coming down the road, maybe we will be having our own Pluto returns in a generation or two from now. Anyway, but to this point, no human has really been able to live that long. But a country can, right? A nation can. A corporation can. An empire can, right? So this is what we get into when we're talking about mundane astrology. We can cast a chart for anything that is born at any given time, whether it is a person or a thing like a nation or a company or corporation or a movement or an empire, right? We can say that the moment that entity was born, it's going to be imbued with the quality of the time into which it was born into, which is really the basis of what astrology is. It's giving us a snapshot of the quality of the time of the birth of any entity in the planetary dynamics and aspects. And so they're showing us what is the quality that thing was born into. And so America was born July 4th, 1776 is a common day we use in America. We celebrate our Independence Day on July 4th every year, even though the country itself, the Constitution, wasn't written and established till many years later. But generally speaking, that is sort of the spirit of the birth of this nation, July 4th, 1776. So we can cast a chart for that day. And it was on that day in 1776 that Pluto was at about, exactly, I should say, 27 degrees, 33 minutes of Capricorn. And on February 20th of 2022, Pluto is about to return to 27 degrees, 33 minutes of Capricorn, the exact Pluto return of the United States of America. So that's a pretty significant event. This is the first time this has happened in this nation. And if we think about Pluto as representing the unconscious desires of the soul, when we think about it and apply it to our own individual charts, if we extrapolate that to a nation, we can say that this is indicating the unconscious desires of the soul of a nation, which is why I'm titling this video as such. So if we look at Pluto and its placement in any chart, whether for a person or a country, what it's going to tell us is what are the unconscious desires of that soul? What is it trying to evolve into and through? What is going to be the most, or one of the most important factors in the personality or the character of that entity, right? And what we're able to do with this mundane astrology, which I think is fun, is we can personify the identity of a nation, right? What is its character? What is its persona? What does America represent? What does it think of itself? How does it project it to the world? What is the emotional nature? How does it communicate, right? What does it produce, right? What is it about? What is the ethos of any nation? And I think it's interesting when you look at when a chart for when a nation is born, you really can start to get a sense of some of these characteristics, and we're going to explore that in this presentation. So I'm going to jump on and share my screen here, and I did write an article about this. I published it on Medium a couple weeks ago, and then I've republished it here on my website just because I wanted more people to to be able to get access to it. In case you're not a Medium member, you can go to astrolab21.com and read the full article, because there's a lot of things I dove pretty deep into it that we probably won't discuss in this video, but I wanted to just give you guys access to that. So check that out if you're interested. So here we are, America's Pluto return, the unconscious desires of the soul of a nation. And when we're talking about America's Pluto, we're talking about Pluto in Capricorn, because when America was born, Pluto was in the sign of Capricorn. So we want to start by setting the table for just getting a sense of what it's like to have Pluto in Capricorn. And this should be very familiar to us all, because we've been talking about this ad nauseum, really, for the last, we've had Pluto in Capricorn now since 2008. It's been a huge factor in the last 2 years. It was a big deal in terms of the coronavirus and the big conjunction we had with Pluto and Saturn and Jupiter all in Capricorn in the spring of 2020. So it should be familiar to us all, but let's just review quickly what we can expect. So if Pluto is that sort of, as I said, it's the evolutionary desire. It's this unconscious, sort of almost libidinal, primal nature that it just desires to change, to transmute, to transfigure, to transform, right? All of these sort of transformational, evolutionary, compulsive urges. That's what Pluto represents. Now, when we get Pluto combined with the archetype of Capricorn, well, there's this deep security need for security, right? Capricorn, to achieve, to build structure, to have order. It's a very obsessed with law and order, right? With authority, with, Capricorn is ruled by Saturn. So it brings some of those qualities of Saturn to it, right? That discipline, that self-control. It has that limiting function. It can be very difficult and challenging, right? It's very conservative. It wants to conserve energy. It wants to conserve values. It can be a little insecure because of that, but it wants to be very productive, very disciplined. There's a lot of structure involved with Capricorn. So Pluto in Capricorn can constellate this desire for structure, this desire for hierarchy, this need to have a framework, to have a hierarchical order. And it's interesting when, if we consider the time in which America as a colony, right, the colonial America, pre-Revolutionary War, it was under the control of the King of England, right? The monarchy, the pinnacle of the sort of Capricorn archetype is a monarchy, that structure. And so there was a desire in the nation to break free from that structure, right? And we'll see that in the chart. But it's also part of its unconscious desire. It's only gonna, we broke free from a monarchy in many ways only to sort of recapitulate that model into a republic, right? We talked about democracy and freedom, but really what we've created is a sort of pseudo-monarchy in some ways, you could argue. I'm sure maybe many political scholars would disagree with me on that, but that was a big concern, right, early on, that George Washington was going to be another King George, and so how are we going to navigate around that? But anyway, here's sort of what we can expect from Pluto and Capricorn. So let's take a look at this chart, and I'm using what's known as the Sibley chart, and this is the most commonly used chart for America, which is cast for 5:10 p.m. In Philadelphia on July 4th, 1776. And there's a lot of historical reasons why we use that time. It references some journals and some diary entries that had talked about the signing of the Declaration of Independence, both in America, in Philadelphia, and notes of correspondences with people back in London. So this has been widely used as one of the most accurate charts for the birth of America. And I think it's interesting because what it gives America this Sagittarius rising. So let's start to look at this, and we'll just start by analyzing the birth chart of America first before we get into the return, because we want to know what is the characteristic, what is the personality of this entity, this nation that's being born on this day at this time, right? We can personify the national character of this nascent being or entity known as the United States of America. So Sagittarius rises, which gives us this, the personality gets presented in this gregarious, philosophical, spiritual, worldly, joyful, fun-loving, expansive type of energy, right? That's Sagittarius, ruled by Jupiter. Just a big ideas, big ambitions, a very fortunate, a very generous, a very liberal type of personality. That's what we would project onto the world. And I think that's very much how America has come to be seen in many ways from the world, right? It's as a global leader. We've emerged as a global leader. We've come to express this Sagittarius rising persona to a large degree. But if we look at the sun, well, this is Cancer season, right? July 4th, America was born a Cancer sun. And we had Jupiter in Cancer, we had Venus in Cancer, Mercury in Cancer, we have a Cancer stellium going on in America's birth chart. So we think about Cancer, right? The homeland, roots, foundations, tradition, very much associated with the notions of patriotism, right? And America can be this almost obnoxiously patriotic country at times. So there's a great pride and security in the sense of home, a sense of place, a sense of America being our foundation, a place that's protected and safe, right? The identity, right? The sun always associates with identity. So we identify through this Cancer archetype. But it gets very complicated by the fact that if we consider by house placement what's going on here, this all is occurring in America's 8th house, which is a very difficult house in many ways. This is the house of agony and ecstasy. This is the house of sex, death, and regeneration. This is the house of trials and tribulations, of ordeals, of the dark night of the soul. Right? It's a very challenging archetype. So this is very complicated. This is not, what this shows us is that this Cancer sun, this patriotism and this welcoming homeland, right, is not as cut and dry or as black and white as it appears. It's complicated. It's murky. There's a lot of hidden agendas going on with the 8th house. There's a lot of secrecy. There's a lot of things that are taking place below the surface. The 8th house is a very political house, right? It's all about politics and those sort of power games. The idea of power and relational power all comes from the 8th house. So this is a very interesting placement for this America sun and this entire stellium. Because if we think about it, America has a very complicated history, right? It's not as cut and dry as a lot of our sort of nostalgia would have us believe, right? The founding fathers and the Declaration of Independence and, this very, it was Aquarian. It was the Age of Enlightenment. It was the ideas of democracy and freedom were very constellated at that time. But we can consider it's a very complicated history, right? Because when the first European settlers came to the Americas, there were already people here. It was already someone else's home, right? There were indigenous peoples and tribes across this entire country who had been living here for centuries, for millennia, right? And so the European settlers came and sort of claimed this as their new home and fairly brutally eradicated a lot of the indigenous population, whether through direct violence and conflict of war, the French Indian Wars, or through the impact of disease. A lot of indigenous people were met with incredibly deadly diseases that the Europeans brought over with them, that they just didn't have any sort of immunity or capacity to handle. So it's a complicated history of America, not to mention that a lot of the Europeans came, especially to the south, with slaves from Africa. This was the height of the slave trade around the world. So we brought slavery onto this country. There was pretty much a genocide that took place amongst a lot of the native populations. So complicated, right? And so that's sort of reflected, I think, in this 8th house sun of America. So something to consider as we look at the chart of America, because, you know, Capricorn, let's talk about where Pluto shows up now, right? Pluto in Capricorn retrograde shows up in the 2nd house of America's chart, right? And what is the 2nd house all about? Well, the 2nd house is about values. It's about possessions. It's about money. It's the money house. It's what we need for security. It's like a physical security, material security. The idea of possessions and value and monetary resources is a key characteristic of the 2nd house. So if we were to put that sort of equation together, if Pluto is the unconscious desire of the soul, and it wants to have Capricorn, structure and security, Earth, which is an earth sign, coupled with the 2nd house of value and resources and money, which is also an earthy material type of orientation. This gives you a little bit of an idea of what is the characteristic of America. What is the soul of this nation sort of obsessed with? It's obsessed with value, with freedom and independence of a financial type, and it wants to have structure and value in a very conservative, hierarchical, Saturnian structured way, right? And I think it's interesting, we talk about what America was fighting for. One of the real sort of key factors in what became the American Revolution, it was really less political, it was more economic, right? You think of the first great event that preceded the revolution, it was the Boston Tea Party. And what was that all about? It was a tax revolt, right? The biggest complaint that the colonists had was no taxation without representation. It was an economic gripe. And there were a lot of taxes and heavy financial burdens being placed upon America at that time, the colonies, I should say. And, you know, you talk about the 2nd house, right? One of the great boons of the colonies to England and to the empire, to the British Empire, was that it was such a vast resource, material resources, the material wealth that was coming from, you know, just the 13 colonies at this point on the eastern seaboard, but all of that farming and agriculture and industry was an incredible boon. The cotton industry alone, right? Very valuable material resources, 2nd house. And that was really the battle that the colonists had with the crown, with the King of England. Like, it was an economic issue. They wanted economic freedom, self-determination. Very much a 2nd house issue. So when we look at this chart here and we find Pluto and Capricorn in the 2nd house, this is telling us a lot about what America is about at its core, at its soul. And as this is coming up for us again, issues of economic freedom, independence, issues of money, issues of value, issues of wealth and resources, issues of structure and hierarchy and authority and limits, right? Capricorn, government, all of these things are constellated by this symbol. And this is what we're dealing with right now as America approaches its Pluto return. There's a few more things to look at before we move to the return, just so we get a little sense of the chart here. You know, America has an Aquarius moon, right? And this is very much Aquarius I associate with the whole spirit of the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason, like that very high idealistic nature. It's a very Aquarian quality. So America feels comfortable when it can be, third house, expressive of these Aquarian ideals and ideas, right? It's all about this brotherhood or sisterhood or fellowship of humanity, right? So it expresses itself verbally, third house, through these Aquarian ideals. And if we think about the Declaration of Independence itself, right, as a document, it has this really emotional, spiritual, Aquarian quality to it. The language is very Aquarian, and it's expressive of this moon, this security need, this ego identity of the personality of this nation. We do have a very Aquarian bent to us. So I think that's an interesting thing to look at. The seventh house is interesting with America, right? Got Gemini as a Sag rising. We get Gemini on the 7th, and we have Mars and Uranus in that 7th house in Gemini. So this is really what's it like to be in a relationship with America? Well, they're fun, they're interesting, they're entertaining, they're gregarious, great talkers, right? Great communicators, very expressive, all these Gemini qualities, very youthful, very innovative, a lot of communications technology. If you think about what America has represented in terms of media over the course of the last 2 centuries, we've been leaders in all of those ways, communicating, expressing, Gemini, right? Well, of course, but it can also be tricky to be in relationship with America because Gemini can also be two-faced. Gemini can be fickle. So getting into relationships with America, and if you think about that, right, America has formed alliances with countries and adversaries, right? I think about, this really reminds me of, the relationship that the colonies had with France during that time, right? France was a great ally to the colonies during the Revolutionary War, supplying materials and financially and otherwise. And so that's an interesting dynamic that has evolved over the years. But Gemini having Mars and Uranus there, it's not easy to be in relationship with America. They can be aggressive. Mars and Gemini, very aggressive with their ideas and intellectually, mentally, right? It gives it a very curious nature. America is interestingly curious about new ways of expressing, new ideas, new technologies, communication technologies in particular. And then you throw Uranus in there, and it's like, that's a real wild card. So not only are they sort of shifty and duplicitous, but can suddenly change at the drop of a hat, and it can flip from one side to the other, right? Uranus is sudden. It's eruptive, it's erratic, it can be very revolutionary, right? And when we talk about revolutions, we often look to Uranus, because Uranus is the ultimate symbol of the rebellious, of the revolutionary, of the eccentric, of the counterculture, right? And so when we're talking about revolutionary war, we should look to Uranus. And Uranus, you could relate this to the difficult relationship that the colonies had with the King of England and with the monarchy at that time, right? And so that revolutionary energy dynamic plays out in this part of the chart. And we could talk a lot more about Uranus, and I'll just sort of plant a seed, because America's Uranus return, so that's every 84 years, right? It takes 84 years for Uranus to complete one full cycle. Well, I will tell you that America's first Uranus return, 1860, I think it was April 1860, coincided with the outbreak of the Civil War. America's second Uranus return, I think it was exact June 6, 1944. D-Day, right? So America will have its third Uranian return in 2028. So that cycle could be very interesting, and it is linked with revolution and in America so far with a history of war. So not to say I'm predicting America will be in war in 2028, but as I always say with astrology, right, it's not concretely predictive, it is archetypally predictive. And America is in a sort of quasi-civil war right now in some ways, the culture war, which is coming to a head. So the next 4 to 6 years are going to be very interesting in that regard. But that's another video that we'll probably do in the next few years. We've got some time. Let's focus on Pluto right now, because this is a big enough deal as it is. Now, just a couple more salient features to point out on this birth chart of our nation here that are pretty significant. If you look at the T-square that the sun is making here to Chiron and Saturn, which are also in a fairly close opposition. So this is a pretty significant aspect in this chart. If I were to analyze this, to look to the source of some very difficult and challenging archetypes here, this would be one of them, right? So Saturn square the sun. So this Cancer sun that wants to be sort of loving and homey and patriotic, it's squaring from this Saturn in Libra in the 11th house, right? Saturn in Libra, it's like, you talk about the justice, right? This demand of justice, this demand for equality. This has a very heavy, responsible, duty-bound quality to it, to the obligation to seek justice, the obligation to be fair. And I guess, to be fair to the founding fathers, they were very much, sort of trying to bring a sense of equality, right? Of justice. A lot of those principles that were coming out of the age of enlightenment and the age of reason were really grounded in early Western social democracy as we know it, despite their flaws. And we can, historically speaking, the fact that women weren't included, the fact that that slaves didn't count as real humans, the fact, there was a lot of, like I said, it's complicated. But this value is there, and it's imprinted on the chart here of the nation. This Saturn is a heavy-duty responsibility, to a social responsibility. Saturn in the 11th, Libra, to really promote the spirit of equality, right? And so this is constellated in this chart in a very profound way. But what's going on? It's in opposition to Chiron and Aries. So I think when I look at this, I think about that spirit of newness and adventure and the manifest destiny of the settlers, the European settlers who came to the Americas and worked their way across this nation in a very impulsive, very Aryan Mars type of quality. We just go west, young man, right? And we really did just completely take over the entire continent. But we did so with a lot of suffering and bloodshed. And again, I'm thinking about the wounded knee, literally, right? Chiron, the wound, the healer. There's something very traumatic about this chart that is connected in this T-square with the sun and Chiron. There's a wounding that in the formation and the creative zeal and zest to build this new nation, this fifth house, right? We did some damage, right? When we were young, right? And so the wound is on this young spirit of this nation that is connected to this sense of fairness. These need to be harmonized. And heretofore, I would say we haven't done a good job of harmonizing this T-square, that this is still unresolved conflict and issue. And so I would hope that we could, and again, this is coming up. All of this Pluto transit is triggering, in a way, this configuration. So it's important to talk about Saturn but we also have Jupiter, right? And so as the ruler of this chart, Jupiter rules Sagittarius, having Jupiter conjunct Venus is just, this is really the symbol of America's generosity. This really, truly kind and, excuse me, liberal and generous and progressive, right? But again, it's coming into, it's a little broader, but it's, it's broadly square that Saturn. So I think in a way, America has this identity crisis, right? Where we are generous and liberal, and it's like, bring us your poor, your tired, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, right? That's famous quote under the Statue of Liberty. And it is appealing, and we are generous in so many ways. But then you get here and you get enmeshed in America's politics and the social strata and all of the complicated history and that eighth house, minutia, and you're just like, this is a fucking shit show right underneath. And so that tension between this Jupiter in Cancer and this Saturn in Libra, and the 8th house and the 11th house, there's a tension that is not resolved, and it involves that early wounding of Chiron. And so there's a calling for us to heal this as a nation. I think this is key to us moving forward into the next cycle. If we're going to move through this Pluto return, if we're going to truly transform the soul of our nation, because that's what's on deck here, folks. We're transforming the soul of a nation. We need to heal this past. We need to go from the wounded to the healer. And the danger is to go from the wounded to the wounder, right? And there's a lot of that energy, I think, seeing in the culture too, where you fucked me, now I'm going to fuck you. All you white guys who ran the world for so long, now we're taking over and, we're putting you down. The racial, the gender battles that are taking place, they're all, I think, tied to this identity of woundedness that needs to be healed. So this gives us a sense of the birth chart, the birth of the nation of America. It's complicated. And again, this stellium in the 8th house in Cancer, Pluto opposes very tightly America's Mercury in Cancer, right? So this gives us, despite all this, Gemini bluster, behind that is a real sort of genuine, heartfelt, truly patriotic type of mentality and mindset. There is something really genuine here. But again, it's the 8th house. It's complicated. It's expressing something that's a very difficult relationship that needs to be healed. There's a great wounding here with this archetype and with this stellium. And I believe it really is the unacknowledged past, the skeletons in the closet, so to speak, of America's sort of dark history, complicated history. And I think, as I mentioned, genocide, slavery, and I think this whole Pluto period that we've been in, this whole Pluto and Capricorn period, I should say, that began in 2008 as Pluto entered Capricorn, right? So I want to put the entire sort of Pluto and Capricorn period into perspective, and this whole period. So the reason I'm doing this video now, it's the first exact conjunction, February 20th, 2022. We're going to get 3 exact conjunctions over the course of this year, right? We'll get another one once Pluto goes retrograde. So I think on July 11th will be the second exact conjunction, and then it'll go direct again, and it'll hit this point again on December 28th. So that, what we call that triple trigger transit in astrology. 3 exact hits here this year. So this is the pinnacle. This is the culmination of this energy. But it's something that is taking place over a 5-year period, because we use an orb of 5 degrees. So once it gets in within 5 degrees of that exact, and then 5 degrees separating, that entire period is taking place over a 5-year time span. So what began in 2020, January of 2020, was really when Pluto first came within 5 degrees of exact of this return. And it's going to last until, what do I have here, 2025, before it separates completely, gets more than 5 degrees away from this 27 degree point. So there's a long, the transits of the outer planets are very long lasting. We're talking about a 5-year period. So everything that's happened since the beginning of 2020, this last 2 years, has been a culmination, right? And certainly America has been in the center of this entire global pandemic in a lot of ways, looking for guidance about how to manage this around the world, our own internal political strife that happened during 2020 with an election year, the racial and social justice issues that came up, right? Bringing up this 8th house history. All of this stuff is being revived, dug up. We're digging, like I said, I think skeletons in the closet. I think there's a reason a lot of this complicated history is coming to the fore. Social justice, the Me Too movement, issues of the patriarchy, right? It's a huge issue in our culture right now. And you think about it, we're talking about the founding fathers. What's more patriarchal than that, right? And if we read that most famous quote from that Declaration of Independence, right? All men are created equal. Not all women, right? And this is the same group of guys who, when they wrote the Constitution, less than a decade later, declared that slaves were only worth 3/5 of a human being. Complicated. So the fact that America is having to come to terms with this complicated past, this history, should be of no surprise when we take this sort of broad, archetypal, astrological lens that allows us to look at this very large cycle, 2.5 centuries in the making, right? And it'll be another 250 years before America gets its second Saturn return. And I think we'll be lucky to see that, If America lasts 500 years, that means that we've done something right during this period, because I think there's a real critical make or break time for our nation in this decade even. So now we can start to look at the transit chart. So this is the birth chart here. And if we bring up the chart now, as we record this video on February 11th, we see that Pluto is already at 27 degrees. We're at 27 degrees, 17 minutes. So we're not quite to that exact point yet, but if I were to take the transit chart forward to February 20th, we will see that it is going to hit a little bit later in that day. Let's get it to 33 minutes. 27 degrees, 33 minutes of Capricorn is the exact Pluto return. So sometime about 9:45 in the morning here on the West Coast. Now it's interesting because along with Pluto coming into Capricorn, we have Venus and Mars exactly conjunct in Capricorn at the same time. And I've been writing about this. I'm going to be talking about this in an upcoming video on Pisces season. This is a huge configuration because they're also going to be conjoining Pluto on March 2nd at this degree. Okay, incredibly powerful moment, and I think it's going to be one of the most powerful days of the whole year of 2022 from an astrological perspective. But this is kind of what's setting up for us on this first exact Pluto return. So we're getting Pluto here. We're getting Venus and Mars along with it, and we can see there's a huge emphasis here on the bottom half of America's chart. We're really looking at an emphasis. If we take out the moon, which will move, within days following, we'll be moving along with every other planet, really from the third, or the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth house, right? It's an emphasis on really the foundation, the foundational energy and identity of America, right? And it's really interesting. I think this is a time of turning inward, right? America's not really focused on the world as much as it often is, right? We've become very insular. We've become very eternally focused. We've pulled out of Afghanistan. We are less involved in the United Nations and NATO and all of these European treaties. We're less involved in Asia and parts of Africa than we ever have been before. Meanwhile, China and Russia are making huge power moves in that vacuum, because America has its own shit to deal with, right? We have so many issues at home, fourth house, right? We can see this Pisces sun in the fourth house, Jupiter, Neptune. It's a huge transit of America's home, our house, our home, our identity, our roots, our traditions, our past. We're taking a really hard look at the past. And we're, by nature, with Pisces on that fourth house cusp, there's a deep connection to the spiritual tradition, to the transcendental tradition, which was a big part, too, of the founding of America. If you think about a lot of the European, we had the Puritans and the Quakers, and a lot of religious freedom was being sought by the early settlers, particularly up in the Northeast and the Eastern Seaboard. A little different identity than those who came to the South and the plantation culture there, but a very religiously oriented mentality. And we still have a lot of that puritanical tradition in this country. Our culture still, is rooted in foundation in Puritan and Protestant and the Quakers and some of the other denominations. It's a very, very strict and a very stern, a very Capricorn, dare I say, very earthy, practical, humble, salts of the earth type of mindset. Again, just reinforces this sort of archetypal complex. But if we think about that fourth house of America, right, being Pisces, being that sense of communion with God, right? One nation under God. God is literally under the chart of America in a way, with Pisces down here on the fourth house. This is one nation under God. And so there's a lot of Pisces energy. We're coming into Pisces season, so this will occur while the sun is just ingressed into Pisces. It's gonna join Jupiter and Neptune later in that month. So there is this sort of potential for redemption here, for forgiveness, for a sense of love, of unconditional love and empathy. But this also can constitute sacrifice, the notion of the martyr, the notion of the scapegoat can be constellated with this type of energy. So it's very interesting to see this emphasis here during this year, or certainly during this first transit, as it triggers and it sets the theme for the entire year. And all three transits we're going to have over that point during the course of 2022. This first one is emphasizing the fourth house of home. So really coming into terms of who we are as a people. What are we about? What is our foundation? What do we stand for? What is this homeland? And of course, the fourth house is the natural house of Cancer. So there's this sort of resonance, and we get, it's a very broad trine, but this earthy, this watery trine between this eighth house stellium natally for the country and this fourth house transiting stellium. There's something about this deep, complicated identity in Cancer as a home, as a nation, as the motherland, if you will, that's calling us to forgive, to heal. All right? And I think that's a big energy I think that's one of these, Pluto's unconscious desire, right? And there's a lot of unconscious energy that has been excavated, that has come to the surface. We've really seen the shadow of our nation in these last 4, 6, 8 years, right? The shadow quality has really revealed itself. And a lot of it's fucking ugly, right? I mean, we've seen some pretty nasty shit go down. And it's there. Like I said, America has a history of racism. America has a history of genocide, a history of not treating some of the indigenous folks and certainly the African American community here. It's so complicated. But we're being forced to reckon with these issues, reckon with these forces, right? And there is this energy and potential to reconcile, but everyone has to come to the table for the collective good, for the bigger picture. Pisces is that biggest possible picture, right? It's the infinite recognition that we are all one, truly. And if we can come together as one nation to heal and put aside our political differences, our social cultural differences, these ridiculous culture wars that we're fighting that they're just silly, that are just eating at the core and the heart and soul of this nation, maybe we got a chance, right? So this energy is supportive of that. Of course, we always have to be on alert to the shadow side of all of these archetypes. And so, as I said, with Pisces in particular, right, there is the sense of self-deception, of delusion and illusion, right? We can get completely deluded by the reality. We can get lost in fantasy. So we maybe have this illusion of what America is when the reality, that Capricorn second house, are coming into somewhat of a conflict and need to be resolved. They're not necessarily in a hard conflict. You've got this sort of earth themed energy here with Capricorn, and you've got a water themed energy with Pisces. And sort of a sextile aspect to a degree. And of course, Pluto and Neptune have been in this sextile dance for, I call it the aspect of the century. It's like 100-year long aspect that they're in, which is harmonious. There is the opportunity across this long period of time to resonate and to harmonize this earthy need for value and practical security, for financial independence and freedom, to be aligned with a sense of a spiritual freedom, a sense of compassion and love and understanding and empathy that creates a truly safe and loving homeland, right? But heretofore, I think those have been in conflict. And so a resolution may be in order. Now, I want to talk more about money and finances specifically, because this really does indicate some very major events around issues of money, right? And around issues of the government in particular. Capricorn is the government and structure and hierarchy, bureaucracy, right? And the second house is about money and values. So, 2022 could be a year of intense battles over the financial resources of the government. Who controls the purse strings? Where should the money be spent, right? And it's, in this period, particularly, as I said, since 2020, we're talking about trillions of dollars being printed, right, by the government in order to prop up the economy that otherwise would have just totally collapsed under the weight of the coronavirus pandemic. Similarly, when Pluto entered Capricorn in 2008, coinciding exactly with the financial crisis and the Great Recession that we've been living in since then, right? Again, trillions of dollars at play, a huge effort by Capricorn, the government, to financially prop up second house the country, and at that time the world, really. Everyone was involved and still is, right? I don't want to, this is about America, so I feel like I can talk a little bit about a sort of national-centric type of perspective. But that's really what's at play here. And so I would expect a very bumpy economic ride in 2022. And it's really getting at to the soul of a nation. Who are we? What do we really value? Where do we want to put our collective resources into, financially speaking? You know, there's a lot of things being discussed, right? This whole issue of universal basic income has been an issue. There's talk of reparations, right? Dealing with the issue of slavery. And that's not a new topic. It's sort of one that's sort of perennially come up in a cyclical way, but it seems to be gaining traction in the current socio-cultural political climate. Not surprising given this configuration, right? This archetypal configuration is supporting these kinds of conversations, addressing these kinds of issues. And that's what Pluto is really about. It's really going to force an evolution and a transformation in the area wherever it is transiting. So Pluto in Capricorn has been revolutionizing and forcing us to fix and to evolve the Capricorn structures that are no longer serving, that will not lead us into this next cycle. How do we set ourselves up for the next 250 years? Big fucking questions, big fucking problems that need us to put on our big boy pants to address them, right? And I think, politically speaking, I don't see the kind of political gravitas necessary to handle these issues. And I think certainly we're in a midterm election cycle in 2022, so expect a lot of these issues to become to the forefront. The economics will be a huge issue, I think, when we look at a lot of these midterm elections, but also some of these, deeper cultural and historical problems needing to be redressed could quite often constellate as well. So, that's kind of the gist of this configuration and what I really wanted to share in this video. And we'll talk about it more as the year progresses, and we'll get a better idea and a sense of how this transit is playing out. And like I said, this energy isn't new. We've been in this transit since 2020, but it's sort of culminating in this year. And then once it passes out and has this triple trigger, Pluto itself is going to move on into Aquarius by 2024 and into 2025. So this next 3 years is going to be very, very critical. And so that covers not only, as I've just talked about, the midterms. This is going to lead all the way through the next election cycle, 2024, and it probably will be when that gets resolved. And certainly before Pluto leaves Capricorn, there is going to be some major changes to the very structure of our society, all of our institutions. It's not just political and government. As I said, it's economic, the education system, the healthcare system. Every system is coming under intense pressure and scrutiny to transform under this Pluto Capricorn signature. And it's just being amplified exponentially by the fact that America is having its Pluto return under this same condition. And as I said, opposing this Cancer 8th house stellium, the identity of this nation and its rather difficult and complicated history. It's as if we're having a dark night of the soul of a nation. And we need to come out the other end, right? If we're going to make it into the 9th house and the sort of, think about that being where our collective North Node is, right? 9th house Leo, right? There's this natural inclination to be a leader, right? Leo, to be that powerful authority, to have a sense of real creative, inspired, expressive, passionate leadership. within the ninth house in a very philosophical, spiritual-minded, liberal, truly progressive, sort of wise sort of leader. I think that's what we're trying to become. That's what this North Node is telling us. And we're coming from a past of being, as I said, this is that age of enlightenment that we were born into, right? This Aquarius third house. It's the ideas, the language, the founding documents of our nation, the age of enlightenment and reason, the Jeffersonian, right? But where are we trying to get to? What is the polarity of that? How do we bring in a truly spiritual, a truly philosophical form of leadership? How can we be a true world leader? I think that's what we're grappling with, and I think this this Pluto transit is really bringing all of that up for us. And again, it's an unconscious. It's volcanic. Remember what we said about Pluto and all of these qualities, right? Volcanic. It's very political, upheaval. It's this compulsive energy, right? Subterranean. It can be associated with the criminal underworld, right? And so a lot of dark backroom politics can be constellated by Pluto, particularly in Capricorn, right? And it's about the grabbing of power, the holding of power. Power is the number one sort of quality of Pluto. So the power to achieve, the power to conserve, the power to hold authority. We're getting a lot of these. This archetype is so heavily constellated in our current culture and society and really the world. Like the issues that are coming to the fore in terms of authority, in terms of what we've been under, the heavy burden of this coronavirus period. Very Capricorn. And we had Saturn there with Pluto when it all began. And so that energy is still sort of constellated. But we really need to get to the deeper Plutonian transformational power, the evolution. We need to move past and through and be reborn through this crucible, this trial, this tribulation, this dark night of the collective soul of a nation. So these are just tough, challenging times. There's just no two ways about it. But we are all born for this. We all were born at this time to be on this planet, to be citizens of this country during this time. So think about your own place in it, right? It's always, I think, insightful and helpful to take this broader, global, mundane frame, this worldly frame. But we always want to take it back to our own personality, our own individuality, our own charts too. You want to think about where is Capricorn taking place in your chart, right? And I have a great resonance with this as a Sag rising, right? There's a real resonance for me because all of this has been taking place in my second house. Capricorn, values, wealth, money, tradition. What is it? What do I value? What is really important to me? What is worth my time, my money, my effort? What do I want to gather to myself? So I have a great sensitivity to this period for sure. And all Sag risings sort of will have that deeper understanding and probably can see through to this chart in ways that maybe others wouldn't, right? We can relate, we can personify, we can identify with a lot of these characteristics, particularly if you're a Cancer sun and a Sag rising, you definitely get the vibe. So anyway, I hope this has been a sort of useful and helpful perspective. I'm sure there'll be a lot of videos on YouTube and a lot of articles written in this next few days and few weeks. And we'll be talking, like I said, we'll be probably talking about this quite a bit over the course of the year 2022 because it is one of the big significant transits going on. And like I said, when Venus and Mars come through in another 2 weeks, boy, that's going to be a really potent, powerful day and week, right? We're really going to initiate something really, very powerful. We're going to feel it. It's going to feel very personal, very emotional, our desire nature for that transformation is going to be aligned with this Plutonian energy. So I'm calling it a sort of, it's like a menage a trois between those three archetypes. And it's juicy, it's sexy, it's racy. So be on the lookout for that. All right, folks, until next time, Satnam.